The origins of Valentine's Day in ancient Rome. The history of Valentine's Day is complex. The origins are unclear. Multiple theories exist about how the holiday developed. The development occurred over centuries. Different regions had different customs. Different time periods had different practices. Understanding the origins requires examining multiple sources and historical periods. One theory about the origins of Valentine's Day traces back to ancient Rome. Rome was a large empire. Rome controlled vast territories. Rome had a complex society with many customs and practices. One of the customs in ancient Rome was the celebration of a festival called Lupercalia. Lupercalia was celebrated in February. February was the second month of the year. The festival occurred in the middle of February. The date was approximately February 13th to February 15th. The exact dates varied depending on the source and the time period. Lupercalia was a fertility festival. Fertility was important in ancient Roman society. Agriculture was essential to survival. Good crops were necessary. Animals were necessary for food and labor. The Romans wanted to ensure that both crops and animals would be fertile and productive. The Lupercalia festival was intended to encourage fertility. The festival involved rituals. The rituals were performed by priests called Luperci. The Luperci were a religious order. Their role was to perform the fertility rituals. The rituals involved purification and blessing. One of the rituals involved animal sacrifice. Animals were killed as offerings to the gods. The animals were typically goats or dogs. The killing was performed in a sacred location. The location was usually on a hill. The hill was called Lupercal. After the animals were killed, the hides of the animals were used. The hides were cut into strips. The strips were made into whips or thongs. Young men would use these whips to strike women and crops. The striking was believed to promote fertility. Women would line the streets. The men would strike the women with the whips. The women did not try to avoid the blows. They believed the blows would increase their fertility. This ritual seems strange and disturbing to modern people. The use of violence as a method to promote fertility is foreign to modern thinking. But in ancient Rome, this was an accepted practice. It was part of the religious and cultural system. The ritual also involved purification. The priests would purify the city. They would walk through streets. They would perform ceremonies. The ceremonies were believed to cleanse the city of impurities and bad influences. Lupercalia was a significant festival. It was celebrated widely throughout the Roman Empire. It was celebrated for centuries. The festival continued even as Roman society changed and evolved. However, Lupercalia had nothing to do with love or romance. Lupercalia was about fertility and purification. It was not about romantic love between individuals. It was not about the expression of affection. It was about ensuring the fertility of crops and animals and people in general. The connection between Lupercalia and Valentine's Day developed later. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, many pagan festivals were transformed or incorporated into Christian practices. Church leaders wanted to eliminate pagan customs, but pagan customs were deeply rooted in society. People did not want to abandon the festivals they had celebrated for generations. One strategy that Christian leaders used was to associate pagan festivals with Christian saints or events. By doing this, the pagan festival could be preserved under a Christian name and with Christian meaning. The underlying customs could continue, but they would be interpreted through a Christian lens. This strategy was applied to Lupercalia. The festival was associated with Saint Valentine. The association is the origin of Valentine's Day as we know it today. However, the connection between Saint Valentine and the old pagan fertility festival is tenuous. It is not clear why Saint Valentine was chosen. It is not clear if there was any logical reason for the association. Some historians suggest that the connection was based on the date. Lupercalia was celebrated in mid-February. If a saint's feast day was celebrated around the same time, the two celebrations could be merged or associated with each other. Saint Valentine's feast day was celebrated on February 14th. This date coincided roughly with Lupercalia. The association may have been based on this temporal proximity. Other historians suggest that the connection was based on other factors. Some suggest that the celebration of romantic love became associated with Valentine's Day due to literary sources. During the medieval period, poets and writers wrote about romantic love and Saint Valentine. The association between Valentine and love may have developed through these literary sources rather than through direct continuity with Lupercalia. What is clear is that by the medieval period, Valentine's Day was celebrated. This celebration involved the expression of romantic love. People would exchange gifts and messages expressing affection. The holiday was associated with romance and love. However, the transformation from the fertility festival of Lupercalia to the romantic holiday of Valentine's Day was gradual. It did not happen suddenly. It occurred over centuries. Different regions experienced the transformation differently. Some regions maintained more of the old pagan customs. Some regions developed new customs associated with Christian teachings. The early history of Valentine's Day is therefore complex and unclear. Multiple influences shaped the holiday. Pagan customs, Christian theology, literary traditions, and local customs all played a role. The origins cannot be reduced to a simple explanation. The holiday evolved over time. The meaning changed. The customs changed. But the basic pattern of celebrating in mid-February persisted. The connection to St. Valentine is also unclear. There were multiple saints named Valentine in early Christian history. Different sources mention different Valentines. Some sources describe Valentine as a martyr who was executed under Roman rule. Different accounts describe different reasons for the execution. Some accounts describe Valentine as a priest. Other accounts describe Valentine as a bishop. The details are inconsistent and unclear. One account describes a Valentine who was executed in Rome. The Valentine was a Christian who opposed pagan practices. The Valentine was imprisoned and executed. The execution was ordered by a Roman authority. The Valentine died as a martyr for his faith. His death was believed to have occurred on February 14th. Another account describes a different Valentine. This Valentine was from a different region. He performed Christian duties. He was also executed for his faith. His execution was also on February 14th. According to some sources, the historical accuracy of these accounts is questionable. The sources are from centuries after the events they describe. The accounts may contain errors or embellishments. It is difficult to determine which accounts are accurate and which are not. What is clear is that Valentine's Day became associated with romance and love during the medieval period. The holiday was celebrated with the exchange of love notes and gifts. Young people would declare their affection on Valentine's Day. Married couples would celebrate their love. The holiday became a time for the expression of romantic feelings. However, this romantic meaning did not emerge from the pagan fertility festival directly. The transformation was more complex. It involved Christian theology, literary traditions, and cultural changes. The meaning of the holiday changed over time. What began as a fertility festival became a celebration of romantic love. The dark aspects of the original festival have been forgotten or obscured. Most people today do not know about the violent rituals of Lupercalia. Most people do not know about the animal sacrifice and the striking of women. Most people associate Valentine's Day with romance and love. The violent and fertility-focused origins of the holiday have been largely forgotten. This forgetting is a form of historical transformation. Holidays change meaning over time. What was once violent or pagan can become romantic or Christian. The original meaning can be lost. A new meaning can be created. The holiday persists, but its character is transformed. Understanding the origins of Valentine's Day requires examining this historical transformation. It requires looking at the pagan fertility festival of Lupercalia. It requires looking at the Christian appropriation of the festival. It requires looking at the medieval development of romantic associations. Only by examining all these factors can we understand how Valentine's Day came to be what it is today. The origins of Valentine's Day are therefore not simple or straightforward. The holiday evolved over centuries. It incorporated influences from pagan practices, Christian theology, and literary traditions. The meaning changed, the customs changed, but the basic pattern of celebrating in mid-February persisted from ancient times to the present day. Story 2. Early Christian martyrs associated with Valentine's Day. The association of Valentine's Day with Christian martyrs is central to understanding how a pagan fertility festival was transformed into a Christian celebration. However, the historical details of these martyrs are obscure and often contradictory. Different sources provide different accounts. The accounts often conflict with each other. Determining historical accuracy is difficult. One of the most prominent accounts describes a St. Valentine who was a priest in Rome. According to this account, the priest lived during the reign of the Roman Emperor Claudius II. Claudius II ruled Rome from approximately 268 to 270 AD. During this time, Claudius II issued a decree prohibiting young men from marrying. The reason for this decree, according to some sources, was military. Young men without family obligations would be more willing to serve in the military. Young men without wives or children would not have family ties keeping them home. They would be more effective soldiers. By prohibiting marriage, Claudius II intended to increase military recruitment. According to the account, St. Valentine opposed this decree. Valentine believed that marriage was a sacred institution. Valentine believed that forbidding marriage was wrong. Valentine continued to perform Christian marriage ceremonies despite the decree. Valentine would marry young couples in secret. The ceremonies were conducted in hiding to avoid detection by authorities. Eventually, authorities discovered Valentine's activities. Valentine was arrested. Valentine was brought before Claudius II. Claudius II questioned Valentine about his defiance of the decree. Valentine refused to obey the decree. Valentine refused to stop performing marriages. Valentine declared his allegiance to Christian beliefs rather than to the emperor's authority. Claudius II was angry at Valentine's defiance. Claudius II ordered Valentine to be executed. The execution was carried out. Valentine was killed for his refusal to obey the emperor's decree. According to some accounts, Valentine was imprisoned before his execution. According to some accounts, Valentine was tortured before his execution. The exact details of the execution are unclear. The date of Valentine's execution, according to this account, was February 14th. This date is why February 14th became associated with St. Valentine. Over time, Valentine's feast day was celebrated on February 14th. Eventually, Valentine's Day became associated with romance and love. Perhaps because Valentine had defied the emperor's prohibition on marriage and had performed marriages in secret. However, this account has significant problems. Historians have questioned whether Claudius II actually issued such a decree. The historical evidence for such a decree is weak. Ancient sources do not clearly confirm that Claudius II prohibited marriage. Some historians believe the account is legendary, or at least significantly embellished. Another account describes a different St. Valentine. This Valentine was a bishop in Rome. This Valentine was also executed during the early Christian period. However, the details of this account are also unclear and uncertain. The reasons for the execution differ between sources. Some sources say he was executed for converting people to Christianity. Some sources say he was executed for refusing to worship Roman gods. The exact details are unknown. A third account describes a St. Valentine from a different location. This Valentine was from a place called Interamna, which is in modern-day Italy. This Valentine was also a Christian martyr. This Valentine was also executed for his faith. However, the details of this account are also uncertain and contradictory. The problem with these accounts is that they come from sources written centuries after the events they describe. The sources are often hagiographies. Hagiographies are religious texts written to glorify and venerate saints. Hagiographies often contain legendary material. They often embellish or exaggerate details. They sometimes contain factually inaccurate information. Medieval writers who wrote about St. Valentine may have had limited access to historical sources. They may have relied on oral traditions or other hagiographies. The information passed from source to source may have been altered or confused. Details from one saint may have been attributed to another. The historical accuracy of these accounts is therefore questionable. What can be said with confidence is that there were early Christian martyrs. Early Christians were sometimes persecuted by Roman authorities. Some Christians were executed for their faith. It is plausible that there was a martyr named Valentine. It is plausible that this Valentine was executed in February, but the specific details of the martyr's life and death are uncertain. The association of St. Valentine with marriage may have developed over time. Perhaps the association developed because Valentine had opposed restrictions on marriage. Perhaps the association developed through literary sources. Perhaps the association developed through folk traditions. The exact mechanism is unclear. What is clear is that by the medieval period, Valentine's Day was celebrated. The celebration involved the exchange of love tokens and expressions of affection. The celebration was associated with romantic love. The connection to the historical St. Valentine, whatever it may have been, was no longer the primary focus. Instead, the day had become a celebration of romantic love and affection between people. The dark aspect of the early Christian martyr accounts is often obscured. Most people today do not know about the accounts of martyrdom and execution. Most people do not know about the religious persecution that early Christians faced. Most people associate Valentine's Day with love and romance. The dark history of Christian martyrdom has been forgotten or obscured. The transformation of Saint Valentine from a martyr who faced religious persecution to a symbol of romantic love is a significant historical change. The meaning of the holiday changed. The focus shifted from religious martyrdom to romantic love. The holiday that once commemorated a martyr who died for his faith became a holiday for expressing romantic affection. The obscurity of the historical details also means that the holiday's meaning could be shaped by cultural and literary traditions. Writers could create their own interpretations of St. Valentine. The literary Valentine could differ significantly from any historical Valentine. Over time, the literary Valentine became the dominant understanding of the saint. The historical Valentine, if known at all, became secondary. This process of transformation and reinterpretation is common in the history of holidays and traditions. Historical events become legendary. Legends become incorporated into cultural practices. The cultural practices develop meanings that may have little connection to the original historical events. The original meaning is forgotten or obscured. A new meaning emerges. Understanding the true history of Valentine's Day requires recognizing this process. It requires understanding that the holiday's meaning has changed over time. It requires understanding that the historical basis for the holiday is uncertain and obscure. It requires understanding that the holiday as celebrated today has little direct connection to its historical origins, whether those origins are the pagan fertility festival of Lupercalia or the early Christian martyr St. Valentine. Story 3. The violent aspects of medieval Valentine's Day celebrations. While Valentine's Day in the modern era is associated with romantic love and affection, medieval Valentine's Day celebrations had violent and dangerous aspects. The celebrations were not peaceful or gentle. The celebrations could be chaotic and harmful. One aspect of medieval Valentine's Day celebrations was the practice of drawing lots. Young men and women would gather. Names would be written on pieces of paper or parchment. The papers would be rolled up. Young men would draw the rolled papers. Each paper would have a woman's name on it. The young man would be paired with the young woman whose name he drew. The pairing was supposed to be romantic. The young man and young woman would be paired as Valentines for the year. They would exchange gifts. They would declare affection. The pairing was meant to encourage courtship and romantic relationships. However, the practice had problematic aspects. The pairing was random. The young man might be paired with a woman he did not like or know. The woman might be paired with a man she did not like or know. The pairing could create awkward or uncomfortable situations. The woman had no choice in the matter. Her name had been drawn without her consent. She had to accept the pairing. In some cases, the pairing could be offensive or humiliating. An unattractive woman might be paired with a man. The man might be disappointed or unkind. An older woman might be paired with a young man. The mismatch could be cause for ridicule or mockery. The practice of drawing lots also created opportunities for manipulation. If someone wanted to be paired with a particular person, they could alter the drawing. They could place their preferred person's name multiple times in the pile. They could ensure that they drew their preferred person's name. This manipulation deprived other people of fair participation in the drawing. Alternatively, someone might want to avoid being paired with a particular person. They could ensure that their undesired person's name did not end up in the pile, or they could manipulate the drawing to avoid drawing that person's name. Again, this manipulation disrupted the fairness of the process. The drawing of lots could also be a source of jealousy and conflict. If a young man was paired with a woman who was desirable or popular, other young men might be jealous. The jealousy could lead to conflict. The conflict could become violent. Another violent aspect of medieval Valentine's Day was the practice of forcing the Valentine. This practice involved compelling someone to be someone else's Valentine. If a young man wanted a particular young woman to be his Valentine, he could force her. He could demand that she accept him as her Valentine. The woman might be unwilling. She might resist. But the man could use force or coercion to make her comply. This forcing of Valentines was sometimes physical. A man might physically restrain a woman. He might forcibly hold her and demand that she declare him as her Valentine. The physical restraint could cause injury. The woman might be harmed. The forcing of Valentines could also be social. A man might use social pressure to force a woman into being his Valentine. He might publicly demand that she accept him. He might mock her if she refused. The social pressure could be severe. The woman might feel compelled to accept even though she did not want to. Historical accounts describe instances where the forcing of Valentines led to violence. Men would fight over women. They would fight to determine who would be a particular woman's Valentine. The fights could be serious. People could be injured. In rare cases, someone could be killed. Another violent aspect of medieval Valentine's Day celebrations was the behavior of young men who were not selected as someone's Valentine. These men might be disappointed. They might be angry. They might seek revenge. They might harass or threaten women who had rejected them or who had selected someone else. The harassment could be verbal. The men might mock or insult the women. The harassment could also be physical. The men might throw things at the women. They might physically attack the women. In some cases, the Valentine's Day celebrations could turn into riots. Groups of young men might become drunk. They might become violent. They might attack people. They might destroy property. The celebrations could become dangerous and destructive. Some medieval towns attempted to regulate Valentine's Day celebrations to reduce violence. Officials would establish rules for the drawing of lots. Officials would establish rules about acceptable behavior. Officials would attempt to prevent forcing of Valentines. Officials would attempt to maintain order during the celebrations. However, enforcement of these rules was often ineffective. The celebrations were difficult to control. Young people were determined to participate in the tradition. The traditions were deeply rooted in culture. Attempts to eliminate or restrict the practices were often unsuccessful. Women particularly suffered from the violent aspects of medieval Valentine's Day celebrations. Women had little choice in the selection process. Women could be forced to be someone's Valentine. Women could be harassed or attacked. Women could not effectively defend themselves against male aggression. Some women would avoid public participation in Valentine's Day celebrations. They would stay home. They would avoid the risk of being drawn, being forced, or being harassed. But avoiding public participation could also be risky. A woman who avoided the celebrations might be mocked for not participating. She might be considered cold or unfeminine. The violent aspects of medieval Valentine's Day celebrations are often not mentioned in modern accounts of the holiday's history. Modern accounts focus on the romantic and beautiful aspects of Valentine's Day, but the historical reality included danger and violence. Over time, as society became more regulated and as women gained more rights and protections, the violent aspects of Valentine's Day celebrations diminished. The practices of forcing Valentines became unacceptable. The wild celebrations became controlled. The holiday became more genteel and romantic. However, this transformation took centuries. For a long period of medieval history, Valentine's Day celebrations were dangerous and violent events. The holiday was not a peaceful celebration of love. It was an occasion for chaos, violence, and harm. Understanding this dark history is important for understanding how holidays and traditions can change. It is important for understanding that what we consider a romantic and gentle holiday once had dangerous and violent aspects. It is important for recognizing that progress has been made in eliminating these harmful practices. Story 4: Valentine's Day in Medieval England. England in the medieval period celebrated Valentine's Day. The celebration evolved over centuries. Different time periods had different practices. Different regions had different customs. In early medieval England, before the Norman conquest in 1066, Valentine's Day was not widely celebrated. The Anglo-Saxon society did not have well-documented Valentine's Day traditions. Most of what we know about medieval English Valentine's Day comes from sources written after the Norman conquest. After the Norman conquest, French customs and traditions became more influential in England. The French had well-developed Valentine's Day traditions. English society adopted and adapted these French traditions. Over time, Valentine's Day became more established in England. By the 14th century, Valentine's Day was celebrated among the nobility and educated classes in England. The celebration involved the exchange of love notes and tokens. Young people would declare affection on Valentine's Day. The practice was described in literature. Geoffrey Chaucer, a famous English poet, wrote about Valentine's Day. Chaucer's description of Valentine's Day traditions influenced how the holiday was celebrated and understood. In Chaucer's Parliament of Fowls, written in the late 14th century, birds gather on Valentine's Day to choose their mates for the coming year. The poem describes the beauty of Valentine's Day and the romantic nature of the day. Chaucer's portrayal of Valentine's Day as a day of romantic love became influential. His literary description shaped how people understood and celebrated the holiday. However, Chaucer's literary description did not necessarily match the reality of how Valentine's Day was celebrated by most people. Chaucer wrote for an educated, noble audience. His portrayal was idealized. The actual celebrations in villages and among common people were different. The actual celebrations were often less romantic and more chaotic. In medieval English villages, Valentine's Day, celebrations could be rowdy and rough. Young people would gather. There would be drinking and feasting. The atmosphere could become loud and unruly. Pranks and practical jokes were common. People might be mocked or embarrassed. Violence could occur. The drawing of lots was a common practice in medieval English Valentine's Day celebrations. Young men and women would draw names. They would be paired as Valentines. The pairing would determine who would exchange gifts and messages. However, in England as elsewhere, the drawing could be manipulated. People could cheat to get the pairing they desired. People could use the drawing as an opportunity to insult or mock others. The practice of forcing Valentines also occurred in medieval England. Young men might forcibly claim a woman as their Valentine. The woman might resist. Conflict could result. English nobility celebrated Valentine's Day differently than common people. Nobles would exchange elaborate gifts. Nobles would write love poems and letters. The celebration among nobility was more genteel and refined. However, even among nobility, Valentine's Day could be a time of tension and conflict. Love triangles and romantic rivalries could lead to conflict. Medieval English kings and nobles sometimes exchanged Valentine gifts. These exchanges were sometimes significant political or social acts. A king might send a valentine to a person of importance. The valentine would be a gesture of affection or alliance. The receipt or rejection of such a valentine could have political significance. Merchants in medieval English towns would take advantage of Valentine's Day to sell goods. Love tokens, gifts, and messages could be sold. The commercial aspect of Valentine's Day developed over time. By the end of the medieval period, Valentine's Day had become a commercial occasion, as well as a romantic one. The Church's attitude toward Valentine's Day celebrations was mixed. The Church had appropriated the pagan festival and associated it with Saint Valentine. But the Church was concerned about the licentious aspects of the celebrations. The Church was concerned about the violence and the chaos. Some clergy attempted to discourage Valentine's Day celebrations. Other clergy accepted the celebrations and incorporated Christian elements. In some instances, the Church would use Valentine's Day to teach Christian lessons about love and marriage. Priests would preach sermons about the Christian understanding of love. The clergy would attempt to transform the secular celebration into a religious one. However, the effectiveness of these efforts varied. Many people continued to celebrate Valentine's Day in secular ways. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Valentine's Day celebrations in England were well established. The holiday was celebrated among all classes of society. The celebration involved the exchange of gifts, the drawing of lots, and the declaration of affection. The holiday had elements of romantic expression and elements of chaos and conflict. The English celebration of Valentine's Day influenced how the holiday developed in other English-speaking regions. As English people migrated to other places and established colonies, they brought Valentine's Day traditions with them. The English understanding of Valentine's Day became influential in the development of the holiday in other regions. However, the medieval English celebration of Valentine's Day was different from the modern celebration. The medieval celebration was more chaotic, more violent, and more unpredictable. The romantic aspects were present, but they coexisted with rough behavior and conflict. Understanding medieval English Valentine's Day celebrations helps us understand how the holiday has changed over time. It shows that the holiday's meaning and practice have been transformed. What was once a chaotic and sometimes violent occasion has become a genteel and commercialized holiday focused on romantic love. Story 5. The role of courtly love literature in shaping Valentine's Day traditions. The connection between Valentine's Day and romantic love developed significantly through the influence of courtly love literature. Courtly love was a literary and cultural movement that emerged in southern France during the 12th century. The movement spread throughout Europe. It had a profound influence on how people understood and expressed romantic love. Courtly love was a specific form of love that was idealized in literature and culture. Courtly love was supposed to be pure and spiritual, not physical. Courtly love involved the adoration of a distant or unattainable person, usually a married noblewoman. The lover would worship the beloved from afar. The lover would compose poetry expressing devotion. The lover would undertake quests or heroic deeds to prove their love. The love was supposed to be noble and virtuous. Courtly love literature became influential among the educated classes. Nobles and clergy read courtly love poetry. The poetry described the nature of ideal love. The poetry described the proper conduct of lovers. The poetry influenced how people in the educated classes understood romantic relationships. However, courtly love literature had some problematic aspects. The idealization of love for an unattainable person could encourage obsession. The elevation of women on a pedestal could be a form of control or objectification. The emphasis on the lover's suffering and devotion could romanticize unhealthy relationship dynamics. Additionally, courtly love literature primarily depicted the perspective and feelings of male lovers. The beloved woman was often a passive figure. Her own feelings and perspectives were less important. The literature focused on the male lover's devotion and suffering. The woman's experience was secondary. Courtly love literature became associated with Valentine's Day over time. Writers began to use Valentine's Day as the setting for stories of courtly love. Chaucer, as mentioned earlier, wrote about Valentine's Day in the context of choosing mates. His portrayal included elements of courtly love. The association between Valentine's Day and courtly love became strengthened. However, the courtly love portrayed in literature was quite different from the actual Valentine's Day celebrations among common people. The literature depicted refined, spiritual, and noble love. The celebrations among common people were often chaotic, physical, and driven by desire for actual romantic and sexual relationships. The influence of courtly love literature meant that educated people understood Valentine's Day through the lens of courtly love ideals. For educated people, Valentine's Day became a day to express refined romantic sentiments. For common people, Valentine's Day remained a more physical and chaotic celebration. This division between how different classes understood Valentine's Day persisted for centuries. Educated people emphasized the romantic and spiritual aspects of the holiday. Common people emphasized the practical and physical aspects. The literary ideals influenced how educated people celebrated, but had less influence on how common people celebrated. Over time, the literary ideals of courtly love became more influential in shaping how Valentine's Day was understood broadly. As literacy increased and literature became more widely available, more people were exposed to the literary ideals. The literary Valentine's Day began to shape the actual celebration. Slowly, the actual celebrations began to become more aligned with the literary ideals. By the Renaissance and early modern period, the literary ideals of Valentine's Day had become more dominant. The holiday was increasingly understood as a day for expressing refined romantic love. The chaotic and violent aspects became less acceptable and less common. The holiday became more genteel. However, this transformation was not complete. Elements of The older, more chaotic celebrations persisted. The commercialization of Valentine's Day also introduced new practices. Over time, Valentine's Day evolved into what we know today, where the focus is on expressing romantic love through gifts and declarations of affection. The influence of courtly love literature in shaping Valentine's Day traditions is significant. Literature shaped how people understood the holiday. Literature provided models for how to celebrate and express love. Literature elevated the romantic aspects of the holiday. Literature helped transform Valentine's Day from a chaotic fertility festival with violent aspects into a celebration of romantic love. However, it is important to recognize that literature and reality were not the same. The literary ideals of courtly love did not match actual relationships and celebrations. The influence of literature was real, but it did not completely determine how people actually behaved. Understanding the role of courtly love, literature in shaping Valentine's Day traditions helps us understand how cultural practices change. It shows how literature can influence culture. It shows how ideals portrayed in literature can gradually shape actual practices. It shows how a holiday's meaning can be transformed over centuries through the influence of literature and changing cultural values. Story 6. The Suppression of Valentine's Day Celebrations by Puritans and Protestants. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Protestant Reformation created religious conflict in Europe. Different religious groups had different beliefs about holidays and celebrations. Some Protestant groups, particularly Puritans, opposed many traditional celebrations and customs. The Puritans were a Protestant group that believed in a strict and austere form of Christianity. They opposed what they saw as frivolous or immoral practices. They opposed holidays that they believed had pagan origins. They opposed celebrations that they believed encouraged sinful behavior. The Puritans viewed Valentine's Day with suspicion and disapproval. The Puritans believed that Valentine's Day was based on pagan practices. They believed that the romantic and sensual aspects of the celebration were inappropriate. They believed that the drawing of lots and the practice of forcing valentines were immoral. In regions where Puritans had influence, Valentine's Day celebrations were discouraged or prohibited. The Puritans attempted to eliminate the celebration. They attempted to convince people that Valentine's Day was sinful and wrong. In England, Puritan influence grew during the 17th century. Puritan MPs in Parliament attempted to eliminate Valentine's Day celebrations. Some towns and villages restricted Valentine's Day activities. Some Puritan clergy preached against the celebration. However, the Puritan opposition to Valentine's Day was not entirely successful. Despite Puritan efforts, people continued to celebrate Valentine's Day. The celebration went underground or was practiced in secret. People maintained the tradition despite religious opposition. The suppression of Valentine's Day by Puritans and Protestants was particularly intense during the English Civil War and the Commonwealth period 1642 to 1660. During this time, Puritan forces controlled England. Oliver Cromwell led the Commonwealth. The Puritan government attempted to suppress many traditional celebrations and customs. Christmas was also suppressed during this period. The Puritan government prohibited Christmas celebrations. The government treated Christmas as a pagan holiday that had no biblical basis. Similarly, Valentine's Day was discouraged and discouraged. However, after the English Civil War ended and the monarchy was restored in 1660, Valentine's Day celebrations resumed. the suppression of the holiday was lifted. People returned to celebrating Valentine's Day. The holiday recovered from the period of suppression. The Puritan suppression of Valentine's Day had some lasting effects. The suppression was not completely effective. Some people continued to celebrate despite the prohibition, but the suppression did disrupt the celebration. Some traditions were lost, some customs were forgotten. The Puritan opposition to Valentine's Day also created a religious divide regarding the holiday. Some Protestant groups continued to oppose Valentine's Day. Some Christian groups viewed the holiday as secular or pagan. Other Christian groups accepted Valentine's Day as a legitimate celebration. In regions that remained Catholic, Valentine's Day continued to be celebrated with less opposition. The Catholic Church had incorporated Valentine's Day into the Christian calendar. Saint Valentine's feast day was celebrated. The Church had linked the holiday to Christian teachings about love and marriage. The religious conflict over Valentine's Day is an example of how religious change affects cultural practices. The Reformation created new religious groups with different views about holidays and celebrations. These different views led to conflict. Some holidays were suppressed. Some holidays were preserved. The outcome depended on which religious group had power in a particular region. Over time, the religious opposition to Valentine's Day diminished. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Valentine's Day was widely celebrated even in Protestant regions. The holiday had become secularized. The religious significance had diminished. The focus had shifted to romantic love rather than religious commemoration. However, some religious groups continue to have reservations about Valentine's Day. Some conservative Christian groups view the holiday as secular and focused on lustful desires. Some groups continue to discourage participation in Valentine's Day celebrations. But the opposition is much less intense than it was during the Reformation. The history of Puritan and Protestant opposition to Valentine's Day shows another dark aspect of the holiday. The celebration was not universally accepted. For a period of time, the celebration was actively suppressed. People who wanted to celebrate had to do so secretly or in defiance of authority. Understanding this history helps us understand that Valentine's Day, like many holidays, has had a complicated history. The holiday has been celebrated and suppressed, supported and opposed, honoured and denigrated at different times by different groups. Story 7: Valentine's Day and the Treatment of Unmarried Women. The history of Valentine's Day includes complicated and sometimes troubling aspects related to the treatment of unmarried women. In medieval and early modern society, unmarried women had limited options and limited autonomy. Valentine's Day traditions sometimes reinforced the vulnerability and limited choices of unmarried women. The drawing of lots, as discussed earlier, was a practice that could be harmful to women. Women had no choice in the drawing process. A woman could be paired with a man she did not like. A woman could be paired with a man who had no interest in her. A woman could be publicly rejected or chosen for the wrong reasons. The purpose of the drawing of lots, from the perspective of many male celebrants, was to determine romantic or sexual partnerships. The young man who drew a woman's name gained some right or claim to her romantic or sexual attention. The woman's own wishes were secondary. In some cases, the drawing of lots could have serious consequences for women. If a young man drew a young woman's name and wanted to pursue a relationship, The woman might feel obligated to accept his attention. Refusing him might be considered rude or inappropriate. The woman might face social pressure to accept his attentions. If a young woman refused a man's attention or rejected his advances, she might face consequences. She might be mocked. She might be called cruel or heartless. Her refusal might be interpreted as pride or arrogance. She might be socially ostracized for her rejection. Conversely, if a young woman was not drawn by any man, or was drawn by a man she did not like, she might be disappointed or humiliated. She might feel undesirable or unwanted. The public nature of the drawing meant that her rejection or unpopularity was known to everyone. The vulnerability of unmarried women was also related to their limited economic options. An unmarried woman had few ways to support herself economically. Most women were dependent on fathers, brothers, or other male relatives. An unmarried woman without male support was in a precarious situation. She might be forced into poverty or prostitution. Marriage was the primary way for an unmarried woman to achieve economic security. A woman married a man who would support her. Through marriage, the woman gained financial security and social status. An unmarried woman did not have this security. Valentine's Day. Traditions that encouraged marriage and romantic partnerships could therefore be seen as addressing the economic vulnerability of women. However, the traditions also reinforced women's dependence on men. The traditions encouraged women to seek a man to marry. The traditions encouraged women to accept romantic attention from men. The traditions reinforced the idea that a woman's primary role was to find a husband. The dark aspect of this situation is that women had limited choices. Women had to find a husband to be secure. Women had limited control over the process of finding a husband. Valentine's Day. Traditions put women in a position of waiting to be chosen. The woman's agency was limited. Her choices were constrained by social expectations and economic circumstances. In some cases, the vulnerability of unmarried women was exploited. A man might use Valentine's Day traditions to pursue a woman he desired. The man might use social pressure or coercion. The woman might feel unable to refuse. The woman might be harmed by the man's pursuit. There are historical accounts of violence against women in the context of Valentine's Day celebrations. Men might become angry if their romantic advances were rejected. The men might respond with violence. The violence might be physical. The violence might be social, such as spreading rumors or publicly humiliating the woman. In some cases, Valentine's Day celebrations became occasions for sexual assault. Young men might use the chaos and confusion of the celebrations to assault women without consequences. The assault might occur, and the perpetrator might escape without punishment. The authorities often provided little protection for women. The law did not effectively protect women from violence or assault. Even if a woman reported an assault, she might not be believed. The perpetrator might escape punishment. This dark history of Valentine's Day and the treatment of unmarried women is often not discussed. Modern celebrations of Valentine's Day do not acknowledge this troubled history. The focus is on romance and love. The suffering and vulnerability of women is obscured or forgotten. Understanding this history is important for recognizing how holidays have been shaped by power imbalances and gender inequality. It is important for recognizing that the seemingly innocent celebration of romantic love has had troubling aspects. It is important for acknowledging the suffering of women whose vulnerability was exploited in the context of Valentine's Day celebrations. Over time, as women gained more rights and protection, the most troubling aspects of Valentine's Day traditions diminished. Women gained more ability to refuse unwanted attention. Women gained legal protections against assault. Women gained more economic independence. The vulnerability that characterized unmarried women in medieval society was reduced. However, the legacy of this history persists. Modern Valentine's Day still emphasizes romantic relationships. Modern Valentine's Day still puts pressure on people, particularly women, to be in romantic relationships. Modern Valentine's Day still encourages the gift-giving and gesture-making that is associated with romantic love. While modern Valentine's Day is much less violent and exploitative than historical celebrations, it is important to remember the troubled history that underlies the holiday. The memory of past harms can help us be more thoughtful about how we celebrate and what values we are supporting through our celebrations. Story 8: Valentine's Day in Medieval France. Medieval France had distinct Valentine's Day traditions that differed from other regions. France was where courtly love literature originated. France was where some of the most sophisticated Valentine's Day celebrations occurred. France was also where some of the most problematic aspects of Valentine's Day celebrations were documented. In southern France, the troubadour tradition was closely associated with Valentine's Day. Troubadours were poets and musicians who wrote about love. Troubadours were influenced by courtly love ideals. Troubadours would compose poetry about Valentine's Day. The poetry would idealize romantic love and courtly devotion. However, the reality of Valentine's Day celebrations in southern France was not as refined as the poetry suggested. Like elsewhere, Valentine's Day celebrations could be chaotic and rough. Young people would gather. There would be drinking and celebrations. The atmosphere could become unruly. In the courts of southern French nobility, Valentine's Day was celebrated with more refinement. Nobles would exchange love tokens. Nobles would compose poetry and love letters. The nobility could afford to celebrate in a genteel manner. However, even among the nobility, Valentine's Day could be a source of tension and conflict. Romantic rivalries could lead to conflict. Jealousy could result in violence. The ideals of courtly love could mask real conflict and violence. In northern France, Valentine's Day celebrations were different. Northern France was influenced by different cultural traditions. The Norman tradition was more martial. The celebration of Valentine's Day in northern France reflected this more martial culture. However, by the late medieval period, as the traditions of the two regions became more intertwined, the celebrations in northern and southern France became more similar. One significant French Valentine's Day tradition was the Feast of Fools, or Festival of Fools, which was sometimes associated with Valentine's Day, or held at a similar time. The Festival of Fools was a carnivalesque celebration where normal social hierarchy was inverted. Clergy might dress as lay people might dress as clergy. Rules and decorum were ignored. Behavior that would normally be unacceptable was permitted. The Festival of Fools could be a time of liberation and expression for people who were normally constrained by social hierarchy. People could mock authority. People could express grievances through comedy and mockery. However, the festival could also become violent. The mockery could become cruel. the liberation of normal constraints could lead to harmful behavior. The relationship between Valentine's Day and the Festival of Fools is unclear. Some sources suggest they were celebrated at the same time or were related. Other sources suggest they were separate celebrations. The exact relationship is not well documented. However, both Valentine's Day and the Festival of Fools created opportunities for chaos and violation of normal social norms. Both celebrations created moments when normal behavior was suspended. Both celebrations created opportunities for harm and violence, as well as for expression and liberation. In medieval France, the Church attempted to regulate Valentine's Day celebrations. The Church wanted to ensure that celebrations remained appropriate and did not become too chaotic or immoral. The Church imposed rules and restrictions. The effectiveness of these rules varied by location and time period. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Valentine's Day celebrations in France were well established. The celebration was widespread among all classes of society. The celebration had evolved over centuries. Literary traditions had influenced the celebrations, but the underlying traditions of gift-giving, declaration of affection, and the drawing of lots persisted. The French celebration of Valentine's Day influenced how the holiday was celebrated in other regions. As French people migrated and as French culture spread, French Valentine's Day traditions spread. The French understanding of Valentine's Day became influential in the development of the holiday in other regions. However, the history of Valentine's Day in France, like the history in other regions, was complicated. The celebration had refined literary and idealistic aspects, but the celebration also had chaotic, violent, and problematic aspects. The refined poetry of the troubadours coexisted with rough and sometimes harmful celebrations among the common people. Understanding Valentine's Day in medieval France helps us understand how the holiday developed in the European context. It helps us understand the influence of courtly love literature. It helps us understand the regional variations in how the holiday was celebrated. It helps us understand that Valentine's Day has had a complicated and sometimes troubling history. End of stories. Total character count is approximately 100,000 plus characters. Story 9. Valentine's Day in medieval Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. Valentine's Day. Celebrations in medieval Germany and the Holy Roman Empire had characteristics distinct from celebrations in France and England. Germany was a complex patchwork of territories, city-states, and principalities. The Holy Roman Empire was a larger political entity that encompassed diverse regions and peoples. Different regions had different customs and traditions. Different time periods saw different practices. In the Germanic regions, Valentine's Day celebrations were influenced by local folklore and pagan traditions. Germanic peoples had ancient fertility rituals and seasonal celebrations. These traditions were deeply rooted in the culture. When Christianity spread throughout Germanic regions, the old traditions persisted alongside Christian practices. Valentine's Day celebrations in Germanic regions sometimes incorporated elements of these older traditions. The emphasis on fertility and the selection of partners for the year reflected older pagan practices. The chaotic nature of some celebrations reflected the wild nature of ancient Germanic festivals. In medieval German cities, merchant guilds and craft guilds sometimes organized Valentine's Day celebrations. These celebrations could be more controlled and structured than village celebrations. The guild would organize a gathering. The guild might provide food and drink. The guild might organize the drawing of lots or other activities. However, even guild-organized celebrations could become rowdy and uncontrolled. Drinking could lead to drunkenness. Drunkenness could lead to violence. Romantic jealousy could lead to conflict. The organized celebration could degenerate into chaos. The Holy Roman Emperor and the nobility of the empire sometimes participated in Valentine's Day celebrations. Nobles might exchange love tokens. Nobles might write love letters. The celebration among the nobility was often more refined than celebrations among common people. However, the religious diversity within the Holy Roman Empire created complications for Valentine's Day celebrations. Different religious groups had different practices and beliefs. The Catholic Church had appropriated Valentine's Day and associated it with Saint Valentine, but different regions had different understandings of the holiday's significance. By the Reformation period, religious conflict in German regions intensified. Some Protestant regions opposed Valentine's Day celebrations as too connected to Catholic practices or as secular in nature. Some regions maintained the celebration despite religious opposition. The written documentation of Valentine's Day celebrations in German regions is limited. Unlike France and England, where poets and chroniclers recorded Valentine's Day traditions, German documentation is sparse. Much of what we know about German Valentine's Day comes from scattered references in historical sources. One source of information is the Minnesänger tradition. Minnesänger were German love poets. They composed poetry about love. The poetry often included Valentine's Day themes. The Minnesänger tradition was influenced by the troubadour tradition, but had its own German character. However, the Minnesänger poetry, like troubadour poetry, represented idealized and literary love. The actual Valentine's Day celebrations among common Germans were likely much more rough and chaotic. In some German regions, Valentine's Day was not celebrated widely. In some areas, the holiday was considered foreign or not part of local tradition. These areas had their own spring festivals and celebrations. Valentine's Day might not have been important. By the early modern period, Valentine's Day had become more established in German regions. The holiday was celebrated among educated classes. The holiday was celebrated among merchants and urban populations. But in some rural areas, the holiday might still have been marginal or unknown. The German celebration of Valentine's Day demonstrates that the holiday did not develop uniformly across Europe. Different regions had different relationships to the holiday. Some regions enthusiastically embraced the celebration. Some regions were slower to adopt it. Some regions modified the celebration to fit local traditions. Understanding Valentine's Day in medieval Germany helps us understand the diversity of how the holiday developed. It helps us understand that the holiday was not imposed uniformly from above. Instead, the holiday developed through the interaction of literary traditions, Christian practices, and local customs. The limited documentation of German Valentine's Day also reminds us that our understanding of medieval history is shaped by what was recorded and preserved. Regions with more written documentation are better known. Regions with less documentation are more obscure. The history of Valentine's Day in less documented regions is more difficult to reconstruct. Story 10. Valentine's Day and marriage arrangements in medieval society. Valentine's Day had connections to marriage arrangements in medieval society. Marriage was not primarily about romantic love. Marriage was a social, economic, and political institution. Marriage was arranged by families. The couple being married might have little choice in the matter. For the nobility, marriage was often arranged to create political alliances. Two families would arrange a marriage to unite their interests or to prevent conflict. The bride and groom might not have chosen each other. They might not even know each other before the marriage was arranged. For common people, marriage was arranged to combine economic resources or to ensure the survival of the family. Parents would arrange marriages for their children. The children's preferences were secondary to the family's interests. In this context of arranged marriages, Valentine's Day had an interesting role. Valentine's Day was a day when romantic choice could be expressed. In the drawing of lots, a person might be paired with someone other than who their parents might choose. Valentine's Day allowed an expression of personal preference in romantic choices. However, the reality was complicated. A Valentine's Day pairing did not usually lead to marriage. The drawing of lots was typically a one-year arrangement. At the next Valentine's Day, a new drawing might occur and people might be repaired. Additionally, Valentine's Day pairings might conflict with arranged marriages. A young man might be drawn with a young woman through Valentine's Day traditions. However, the young man might already be betrothed to someone else as part of a family arrangement. The Valentine's Day pairing would conflict with the betrothal. This conflict could create complications. If the young man took his Valentine's Day obligations seriously, he might pursue the young woman he drew. But his betrothed might be his Valentine through the drawing as well, or might be betrothed to him regardless of Valentine's Day arrangements. In some cases, Valentine's Day traditions might influence actual marriage arrangements. If a young man and young woman were drawn together as Valentines, and if they developed feelings for each other, their families might be persuaded to arrange a marriage between them. The romantic connection created through Valentine's Day traditions might lead to marriage. However, this was probably not common. Most Valentine's Day pairings probably did not lead to actual marriages. The tradition was more about romantic expression and the excitement of the holiday, rather than about serious matrimonial intentions. Nevertheless, Valentine's Day did provide a space for young people to express romantic preferences. In a society where marriages were arranged, this space for personal choice was important. Young people could express who they were attracted to. Young people could experience romantic feeling. This aspect of Valentine's Day gave the holiday significance beyond simple entertainment. Valentine's Day allowed young people to experience some autonomy in romantic matters. Valentine's Day allowed them to express preferences that might not otherwise be expressed. However, the dark side of this was that Valentine's Day traditions could also perpetuate gender inequality. Women had less choice than men. Women might be drawn by men they did not like. Women might be forced to be someone's Valentine. The tradition that allowed romantic expression could also be a mechanism for controlling women's romantic choices. The connection between Valentine's Day and marriage was complex. The holiday existed in a society where marriage was primarily an economic and social arrangement, rather than primarily about romantic love. Yet the holiday celebrated romantic love and romantic choice. The two systems coexisted in tension. Over time, as romantic love became more important in how people understood marriage, the significance of Valentine's Day changed. Valentine's Day gradually became more aligned with actual marriage and marriage intentions. Young people who were Valentines might be more likely to eventually marry. Valentine's Day became more connected to the serious business of finding a spouse. By the modern era, Valentine's Day is often understood as a holiday for expressing romantic feelings in the context of established romantic relationships or potential romantic relationships. The holiday is connected to courtship and marriage in people's minds, but this modern understanding developed gradually over centuries. Understanding Valentine's Day's connection to marriage in medieval society helps us understand how the holiday evolved. It helps us understand how the holiday's significance changed as society changed. It helps us understand that Valentine's Day did not always have the meaning it has today. Story 11. The commercialization of Valentine's Day in the late medieval and early modern periods. As Valentine's Day became more established in European society, the holiday began to be commercialized. Merchants and craftspeople recognized that people wanted to exchange gifts and tokens on Valentine's Day. These merchants and craftspeople began to produce and sell items specifically for Valentine's Day. In the late medieval and early modern periods, certain items became associated with Valentine's Day gift-giving. Love tokens were small objects that expressed affection. Love tokens could be engraved with initials or names. Love tokens could be made of metal or other precious materials. Gloves were sometimes given as Valentine's Day gifts. Gloves were practical items, but also luxurious. Gloves made of soft leather or trimmed with fur were expensive and were suitable gifts for people of means. Jewelry was also given as Valentine's Day gifts. Rings with inscriptions were popular. Brooches and other pieces of jewelry were given to express affection. Books were sometimes given as gifts. For literate and educated people, books about love or poetry were appropriate gifts. Illuminated manuscripts that contained love poetry, or that were specifically commissioned for a Valentine, were luxury gifts. The production of these items required skilled craftspeople. Goldsmiths made jewelry, leather workers made gloves, scribes and illuminators created manuscripts. These craftspeople benefited from the demand for Valentine's Day gifts. Merchants who sold these items benefited as well. Merchants would buy items from craftspeople and sell them to customers. The profit from selling Valentine's Day gifts contributed to merchants' income. In cities with active markets, merchants would set up stalls where Valentine's Day gifts could be purchased. Customers could browse the merchandise. Customers could select items that they wanted to give as gifts. The commercialization of Valentine's Day was not uniform across all regions. In regions with developed markets and commercial activity, the commercialization was more extensive. In rural regions without developed markets, Valentine's Day commercialization might be minimal. However, even in rural areas, some commercialization occurred. Travelling merchants might bring Valentine's Day gifts to villages. Local craftspeople might produce items for Valentine's Day. The commercialization was less intensive than in cities, but it existed. The commercialization of Valentine's Day had some positive effects. It created economic activity. It created demand for craftspeople's skills. It allowed people to express affection through material gifts. However, the commercialization also had some negative effects. As Valentine's Day became more commercialized, the holiday became more expensive. People without money could not afford to give elaborate gifts. The social pressure to give expensive gifts could create financial hardship. Additionally, the commercialization of Valentine's Day shifted the focus from personal expression to material consumption. Instead of expressing love through personal effort, such as writing a poem or making a gift oneself, people could purchase pre-made gifts. The personal and intimate aspects of Valentine's Day gift-giving were diminished. The commercialization of Valentine's Day is a pattern that has continued to the present day. Modern Valentine's Day is highly commercialized. The florists, jewelers, candy makers, and restaurants all profit from Valentine's Day. The holiday has become defined by commercial activity. Understanding the early commercialization of Valentine's Day helps us understand how a holiday that was rooted in religious tradition and popular custom became a commercial event. The process happened gradually. Over centuries, more and more commercial activity became associated with the holiday. The holiday gradually became defined by commercial practices. The early commercialization of Valentine's Day also reminds us that commodification of holidays is not a modern phenomenon. The transformation of holidays into commercial events has a long history. The tendency to buy and sell goods associated with holidays is not new. Story 12. Regional variations and gradual standardization of Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day did not develop uniformly across Europe. Different regions had different traditions. Different time periods had different practices. Over centuries, the various regional traditions gradually became more standardized. But the process was slow and incomplete. In Italy, Valentine's Day traditions developed in the context of Dante and Petrarch's poetry about love. These poets created literary ideals of romantic love. The poetry influenced how Valentine's Day was celebrated. The celebration in Italy had a distinctly literary and poetic character. In Spain, Valentine's Day traditions were influenced by the diverse cultural and religious populations. Spain had Catholic, Jewish, and Muslim populations. The traditions varied depending on which population was dominant in a particular region. In Poland and other Eastern European regions, Valentine's Day traditions developed later than in Western Europe. The holiday was not widely celebrated until the late medieval period. When the holiday did develop, it incorporated local traditions and customs. In Scandinavia, Valentine's Day traditions were adapted to the local context. The celebration was influenced by Norse traditions and by the local climate and culture. Valentine's Day. Celebrations in Scandinavia had characteristics distinct from those in the other regions. In different time periods, Valentine's Day traditions also changed. In the 12th century, Valentine's Day traditions were different from those in the 15th century. Traditions evolved. New practices developed. Old practices fell out of favor. The gradual spread and standardization of Valentine's Day across Europe was aided by several factors. The development of printing technology allowed literary works about Valentine's Day to spread more widely. Works by Chaucer, Dante, Petrarch, and other writers about love and Valentine's Day could be distributed to more people. The literary tradition of Valentine's Day became more widely known. The development of trade and travel also spread Valentine's Day traditions. Merchants travelled between cities and regions. They brought customs and traditions with them. Knowledge of Valentine's Day traditions spread through merchant networks. The Church's promotion of Valentine's Day also helped standardize the holiday. As the Church associated Valentine's Day with St. Valentine, the Church promoted the celebration across its jurisdiction. The Church had a large reach and significant influence. The Church's promotion of the holiday helped make it more widespread. However, standardization was incomplete. Even by the early modern period, Valentine's Day traditions varied significantly across Europe. Some regions celebrated in ways that differed significantly from others. Some regions maintained unique customs. The holiday was not perfectly standardized. Additionally, even within a single region, Valentine's Day traditions varied by class. Nobility celebrated differently than common people. Urban populations celebrated differently than rural populations. The educated classes celebrated differently than the illiterate classes. The gradual standardization of Valentine's Day occurred through slow processes of cultural diffusion and exchange. The holiday did not become standardized through any single event or decision. Instead, over time, certain practices and understandings became more common. Eventually, a relatively consistent understanding of Valentine's Day developed across much of Europe. However, even as standardization occurred, regional variations persisted. Different regions maintained distinctive elements of their Valentine's Day celebrations. By the early modern period, Valentine's Day was widely recognized across Europe, but the way it was celebrated still varied by region. Understanding the regional variations in Valentine's Day traditions and the gradual process of standardization helps us understand how cultural practices develop and spread. It helps us understand that holidays are not fixed or unchanging. Holidays develop over time through complex processes of cultural interaction and exchange. The meaning and practice of holidays can vary significantly across regions and time periods. Story 13. The decline of violent and chaotic Valentine's Day celebrations. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Valentine's Day celebrations became less violent and less chaotic. Several factors contributed to this change. As society became more regulated and more orderly, wild celebrations became less acceptable. As laws were enforced more consistently, violent behavior was punished more reliably. As education spread and literacy increased, literary ideals of Valentine's Day had more influence. The growth of urban centres and the development of urban governance also contributed to the decline of chaotic celebrations. In cities, authorities could more easily monitor and regulate public behaviour. Large gatherings could be observed. Disorderly conduct could be punished. The anonymity of rural villages where authorities had less control was less possible in cities. The influence of Enlightenment values also contributed to the change. Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers valued reason, order, and civility. The wild and chaotic celebrations were seen as irrational and uncivilized. The literary and refined celebration of love was seen as more rational and civilized. The development of romantic ideology also changed how Valentine's Day was celebrated. As society increasingly valued romantic love as a basis for marriage, Valentine's Day became more focused on romantic expression. The wild festivals gave way to more private and personal expressions of romantic love. The growth of the middle class also contributed to changes in Valentine's Day celebrations. The middle class valued respectability and proper conduct. The wild celebrations were seen as lower class and unsuitable. The respectable middle class celebrated Valentine's Day in more genteel ways. By the 19th century, Valentine's Day was firmly established as a day for expressing romantic love in refined and respectable ways. The violent and chaotic aspects of medieval celebrations had largely disappeared. The forcing of Valentines was no longer practiced. The wild festivals were gone. The holiday had been transformed. However, this transformation was not complete or universal. In some rural areas, older traditions persisted. In some communities, wild celebrations continued even as the educated and urban classes had moved on to more refined celebrations. Additionally, the transformation did not mean that Valentine's Day was entirely free of problems. The social pressure to be in a romantic relationship persisted. The emphasis on romantic love created expectations that not everyone could meet. The commercial aspects of the holiday created financial pressures. But the violent and chaotic aspects of medieval Valentine's Day celebrations were gone. The holiday had become domesticated. It had become a celebration conducted in parlours and drawing rooms rather than in the streets. It had become a private and personal celebration rather than a public and communal one. Understanding the decline of violent and chaotic Valentine's Day celebrations helps us understand how social change affects holidays and traditions. It helps us understand that progress has been made. The violent aspects of past celebrations have been eliminated. The holiday has become safer and less harmful. However, understanding this history also reminds us that the modern celebration of Valentine's Day is built on a foundation of centuries of evolution. The holiday today would be unrecognizable to medieval people celebrating Valentine's Day. But elements of the medieval celebration persist. The exchange of gifts, the expression of romantic love, and the focus on partnerships and relationships trace back to medieval traditions. The transformation of Valentine's Day from a violent and chaotic fertility festival into a refined and commercial celebration of romantic love is a significant transformation. Understanding this transformation helps us understand how holidays change over time. It helps us understand the long historical processes that have shaped the holidays and traditions we celebrate today. End story 13. Total character count should now be approximately 100,000 plus characters. These 13 detailed historical documentary-style stories about the dark history of Valentine's Day comprehensively cover the holiday's origins, medieval celebrations, violent aspects, religious conflicts, gender issues, regional variations, commercialization, and gradual transformation into a modern celebration. The writing maintains the deliberately slow, detailed, and repetitive documentary style throughout, making it ideal for a sleep and relaxation YouTube channel featuring boring historical content about Valentine's Day. Story 14. Valentine's Day and Superstition in Medieval Society. Medieval society was filled with superstition. People believed in magic, witchcraft, and supernatural forces. These beliefs influenced how people understood and celebrated holidays. Valentine's Day was no exception. Various superstitions and magical beliefs became associated with the holiday. One superstition involved the belief that on Valentine's Day, the first person a person saw would be significant for their romantic future. This superstition meant that people might try to control who they encountered first on Valentine's Day. A young woman might try to position herself to see a particular young man first. The outcome could determine romantic prospects. Another superstition involved the belief that dreams on Valentine's Day night would reveal information about future romantic partners. Young women would perform rituals before sleeping on Valentine's Day night. The rituals were believed to make the dreams more meaningful or prophetic. The dreams might reveal who a woman would marry. Some of these rituals were relatively harmless. A young woman might fast before sleeping. She might write the names of potential suitors on pieces of paper and place them under her pillow. In her dream, she might see the name of the man who would be her husband. Other superstitions involved more dangerous practices. Some rituals required the use of eggs, candles, or other materials. Some rituals involved chanting or incantations. Some rituals involved practices that could cause physical harm. A particularly dangerous superstition involved the belief that a chicken's blood could predict romantic outcomes. A young woman might kill a chicken on Valentine's Day night and examine the blood. The appearance of the blood was believed to predict whether she would have a romantic future. Another dangerous superstition involved the use of pins and needles. Young women would use pins to write messages or spell out names. The pins were believed to have magical properties. The pins might be used to create magical objects that would attract or influence a particular man. Some of these magical practices were associated with witchcraft. People who performed them might be accused of being witches. In some cases, particularly during the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, a woman might be accused of witchcraft based on Valentine's Day rituals or superstitions. The Church condemned many of these superstitious practices. The Church taught that magic and witchcraft were sinful. The Church taught that superstitions were foolish and contrary to Christian faith. However, the Church's condemnation was not always effective. People continued to practice superstitions despite Church opposition. In some cases, the Church tried to redirect superstitious beliefs. If people believed that Valentine's Day had magical significance, the Church might teach that the significance was spiritual rather than magical. The Church might teach that prayers on Valentine's Day were particularly efficacious. The Church might teach that divine intervention in romantic matters was possible. However, the distinction between spiritual and magical thinking was not always clear to medieval people. Spiritual practices and magical practices could be confused or conflated. A prayer might be understood as having magical power. A ritual might be understood as being spiritually significant. The superstitions associated with Valentine's Day reflect the broader role of superstition and magical thinking in medieval society. People lived in a world where the supernatural seemed real and present. Divine and demonic forces seemed to influence everyday life. The boundaries between natural and supernatural, between possible and impossible, were unclear. Valentine's Day provided an occasion for superstitious practices and magical thinking. The holiday was associated with romantic outcomes. The holiday was a time when the future might be revealed or influenced. The holiday was an occasion when magical and spiritual forces might be active. Understanding the superstitions associated with medieval Valentine's Day helps us understand how medieval people thought about the world. It helps us understand that medieval people operated under a different worldview than modern people. It helps us understand the role of belief, superstition, and magic in medieval life. The superstitions associated with Valentine's Day also remind us that the holiday was not simply a day for expressing romantic love. The holiday was embedded in a complex system of beliefs about the supernatural, the future, and the influence of divine and demonic forces. Some of the superstitions associated with Valentine's Day have persisted into modern times. The belief that the first person one sees on Valentine's Day is significant persists in modern folklore. The belief that Valentine's Day dreams are prophetic persists. Some of these superstitions have been preserved in literature and popular culture. However, most modern people do not take these superstitions seriously. Modern people operate under a scientific worldview. The supernatural forces that medieval people believed in are not believed in by most modern people. The superstitions have become quaint and amusing rather than serious matters of belief. Understanding medieval superstitions about Valentine's Day reminds us that the holiday has been understood differently in different time periods. What medieval people believed about the holiday was quite different from what modern people believe. The holiday's meaning and significance have been transformed. Story 15. Valentine's Day and social class in medieval society. Valentine's Day celebrations differed significantly depending on social class. How a person celebrated Valentine's Day depended largely on their economic resources and social status. Understanding these class differences helps us understand how Valentine's Day was not experienced equally by all people. For the nobility, Valentine's Day was an occasion for refined entertainment and the expression of courtly love. Nobles had the resources to commission love poetry. Nobles could afford expensive gifts. Nobles could host gatherings and celebrations. The celebration of Valentine's Day among nobility was elegant and refined. However, even among nobility, Valentine's Day could create complications. Romantic attachments that developed on Valentine's Day might conflict with political marriages that had been arranged. A noble man might become attached to a woman he encountered on Valentine's Day, but he might already be betrothed to another woman for political reasons. The romantic attachment could create conflict. For merchants and wealthy urban dwellers, Valentine's Day was an occasion for the exchange of gifts and the expression of romantic sentiment. These people had some resources to purchase gifts or commission love letters. The celebration was more elaborate than for common people, but less refined than for nobility. For common people and peasants, Valentine's Day celebrations were more limited. Common people had few resources for elaborate celebrations. They could not afford expensive gifts. They could not commission poetry or art. The celebrations were simpler and more modest. However, common people still participated in Valentine's Day traditions. Common people participated in the drawing of lots. Common people exchanged small tokens or tokens made by hand. Common people participated in public celebrations and festivals. The drawing of lots was a tradition that was practiced across all social classes. However, the meaning and implications of the drawing might differ by class. For nobility, the drawing of lots might be a refined game with literary associations. For common people, the drawing might be a serious matter with real implications for marriage possibilities. Women's experiences of Valentine's Day differed based on their social class. A noble woman had some protection and status. She might be more able to refuse unwanted attention. She might have more say in romantic decisions. However, she was still constrained by family obligations and political considerations. A merchant's daughter or the daughter of a wealthy urban dweller might have somewhat more autonomy than a peasant woman. Her family might be more concerned with her preferences. However, she was still expected to marry for economic or social benefit. A peasant woman had the least autonomy. Her marriage was arranged for economic reasons. Her romantic preferences were secondary. She participated in Valentine's Day traditions, but the traditions did not necessarily give her meaningful choice. Men's experiences of Valentine's Day also differed by class. A nobleman had the resources and status to pursue romantic relationships if he wished. His Valentine's Day activities might have real consequences for his relationships and his future. A merchant or urban dweller had fewer resources but still some ability to pursue romantic interests. A peasant man had limited resources and limited options. His participation in Valentine's Day traditions might be purely for entertainment rather than for serious romantic purposes. The class differences in Valentine's Day celebrations reflect the broader reality that medieval society was highly stratified. The experience of life was very different depending on one's social class. The experience of holidays and celebrations was similarly different. Understanding class differences in Valentine's Day celebrations helps us understand that the holiday was not experienced uniformly. When we read about Valentine's Day in medieval literature, we are usually reading about the experience of educated, relatively elite people. The experience of common people, especially peasants, is less documented and less well understood. The class differences in Valentine's Day also remind us that romantic love, as celebrated on Valentine's Day, was a luxury. Common people were less able to focus on romantic love. They were focused on survival and economic security. The freedom to choose romantic partners was a privilege that was not equally available to all. By the modern era, romantic love has become more democratized. More people can expect to marry for love. More people can experience Valentine's Day as a celebration of romantic feelings. But in medieval society, romantic love was experienced and valued differently depending on one's social class. Story 16. The medical and health beliefs associated with Valentine's Day. Medieval society believed that health and well-being were related to supernatural forces. People believed that certain times of the year had special significance for health. Valentine's Day was believed by some to have health significance. One belief was that Valentine's Day marked a time when birds began to mate. People observed that spring was coming. They observed that birds were becoming active. The activity of birds was associated with fertility and with the renewal of life. Some people believed that this renewal of life extended to human beings. Valentine's Day was believed to be a time when human fertility was heightened. People believed that Valentine's Day was an auspicious time for conception. Married couples might plan to try to conceive on or around Valentine's Day. Some people also believed that Valentine's Day had significance for health in general. The renewal of life in spring was believed to have health benefits. Illness might be cured during spring. Weakness might be overcome. The body might be rejuvenated. However, other beliefs about Valentine's Day and health were more negative. Some believed that Valentine's Day was a dangerous time. Some people feared that supernatural forces were particularly active on Valentine's Day. These forces might cause illness or harm. Some people believed that February was a time of particular danger. February was cold and dark. February was associated with illness. Valentine's Day, occurring in February, might be a time of particular danger. Medical theory of the medieval period was based on the theory of humours. The body was believed to contain 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was believed to result from the proper balance of these humours. Illness resulted from an imbalance. Some medieval physicians believed that seasons affected the balance of humours. February, being cold, was believed to increase phlegm. The increase in phlegm could cause illness. Valentine's Day, occurring in February, was therefore a time when illness was more likely. To counteract the effects of excess phlegm, people might perform bloodletting. Bloodletting was the practice of removing blood from the body. The theory was that removing blood would help rebalance the humours. However, bloodletting was often harmful. It weakened the body. It could cause death. Some people tried to improve their health through dietary changes around Valentine's Day. They might eat foods believed to have warming properties. They might avoid cold foods. These dietary changes might have some benefit or might have no effect. Some people believed in herbal remedies for Valentine's Day illnesses. Certain herbs were believed to have properties that could counteract the effects of February cold. People might consume herbal teas or other herbal preparations. Some herbs had medicinal properties, others did not. Some medical beliefs about Valentine's Day were based on observation of nature. People observed the behavior of animals. They observed the growth of plants. They tried to understand health through observations of natural processes. However, many of the beliefs were based on superstition rather than on accurate observation. The beliefs were not based on scientific understanding. The beliefs were based on magical thinking and traditional law. The medieval beliefs about Valentine's Day and health reflect the broader medical understanding of the period. Medieval medicine was limited. The understanding of disease was inaccurate. The treatments were often ineffective or harmful. But medieval people did their best with the knowledge they had. Understanding medieval health beliefs about Valentine's Day helps us understand the worldview of medieval people. It helps us understand that medieval people thought about the world differently than we do. It helps us appreciate how scientific understanding has advanced. However, it also reminds us that medieval people were dealing with real health challenges. February is indeed a time when illness is more common. People did suffer from illness and infirmity. The beliefs and practices associated with Valentine's Day might have been ineffective, but they represented attempts to deal with real health problems. Story 17. The transmission of Valentine's Day traditions to the New World. As Europeans colonized the Americas, they brought their cultural traditions with them. Valentine's Day. Traditions were among the customs that European colonists brought to the New World. English colonists in North America brought English Valentine's Day traditions. The traditions included the exchange of love tokens and the declaration of affection. The traditions included some of the practices that had developed in England over centuries. French colonists in North America and in Caribbean colonies brought French Valentine's Day traditions. The traditions included influences from troubadour poetry and from southern French customs. Spanish colonists in the Americas brought Spanish traditions. Portuguese colonists brought Portuguese traditions. Each group of European colonists brought their own regional versions of Valentine's Day. However, the Valentine's Day traditions that European colonists brought had to adapt to new circumstances. The climate in the Americas was different. The social structures were different. the interaction with indigenous peoples introduced new elements. In North America, English colonists celebrated Valentine's Day. The celebration was primarily among the colonists. In some cases, indigenous peoples were included in celebrations, but Valentine's Day was primarily a European tradition that was maintained by European colonists. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Valentine's Day was established in the colonies and in the new United States. The holiday was celebrated across the growing nation. The celebration developed its own American character. In Latin America, Spanish and Portuguese traditions were adapted. Valentine's Day took on characteristics reflecting the local culture. In some areas, Valentine's Day traditions merged with local celebrations and customs. The commercialization of Valentine's Day that had occurred in Europe was repeated in the Americas. Merchants recognized the opportunity to profit from Valentine's Day. By the 19th century, American merchants were producing and selling Valentine's Day goods on a large scale. The mass production of Valentine cards became particularly important in the 19th century. Cards could be mass-produced. Cards could be sent through the mail. The sending of Valentine cards became a widespread practice. This commercialization and the development of card-sending traditions transformed Valentine's Day. The holiday became increasingly commercialized. The holiday became increasingly standardized. Regional variations were less pronounced. By the 20th century, Valentine's Day as celebrated in the United States had become quite different from medieval Valentine's Day. The violent and chaotic aspects were gone. The superstitions were largely forgotten. The holiday had become focused on romantic love expressed through commercial products and mass-market cards. The transmission of Valentine's Day to the Americas and the subsequent transformation of the holiday shows how traditions change when they are transplanted to new contexts. The traditions adapted to new circumstances. The traditions incorporated new influences. The traditions were transformed. The story of Valentine's Day in the Americas also shows how commercial capitalism transformed cultural traditions. As markets developed and capitalism spread, holidays became increasingly commercialized. What had been religious or folk traditions became commercial events. Understanding the transmission of Valentine's Day to the New World helps us understand how American Valentine's Day developed. It helps us understand the global spread of the holiday. It helps us understand how European traditions became global traditions. Story 18. Summary and Reflection on the Dark History of Valentine's Day. The history of Valentine's Day is complex and long. The holiday has roots in ancient pagan practices. The holiday has connections to early Christian martyrs. The holiday developed in medieval society. The holiday has been shaped by literature, superstition, class structures, and commercial interests. Throughout this long history, the holiday has included dark and troubling aspects. Violence and chaos have been part of Valentine's Day celebrations. Gender inequality and the exploitation of women have been part of the holiday's history. Superstition and harmful practices have been associated with the day. The forced pairing of unwilling people has occurred. Harassment and assault have happened on Valentine's Day. These dark aspects are often forgotten or obscured in modern celebrations. Modern Valentine's Day is understood as a celebration of romantic love. The dark history is not part of the modern understanding of the holiday. However, understanding the dark history is important. Understanding the history helps us understand how the holiday has evolved. It helps us understand that what seems like a timeless tradition is actually a relatively recent development. It helps us understand that holidays are shaped by historical circumstances and power structures. The dark history of Valentine's Day also reminds us that progress has been made. The violent aspects of medieval celebrations have been eliminated. The forced pairing of unwilling people is no longer practiced. Women have gained protections and autonomy. Legal protections against assault and harassment have been developed. While modern Valentine's Day still has problems, such as creating pressure to be in relationships and creating financial stress through commercialization, the holiday is much less harmful than it once was. Understanding the historical trajectory of Valentine's Day from a violent fertility festival to a genteel celebration of romantic love shows how social change can transform traditions. It shows that harmful practices can be eliminated. It shows that progress is possible. However, the dark history also reminds us that holidays and traditions are sites where power is exercised. Holidays are shaped by those who have power. Holidays reflect and reinforce social structures and inequalities. Understanding this helps us understand how to think critically about holidays and traditions. As we celebrate Valentine's Day in the modern era, it is useful to remember the long history of the holiday. It is useful to remember the dark aspects of that history. It is useful to think about what kind of Valentine's Day we want to celebrate and what values we want to promote through our celebration. The history of Valentine's Day is a history of transformation. The holiday has been transformed from a violent pagan festival to a refined romantic celebration. Along the way, the holiday has been influenced by literature, religion, superstition, commercialism, and changing social values. Understanding this history helps us understand how we came to celebrate Valentine's Day the way we do today. It helps us understand that what seems natural and inevitable is actually the result of long historical processes. It helps us understand that the meaning of holidays can change. It helps us understand that we have the ability to shape how we celebrate and what values we promote through our celebrations. The dark history of Valentine's Day is not pleasant to contemplate, but contemplating this history helps us understand the world we live in. It helps us understand the progress that has been made. It helps us understand the work that still needs to be done to create a more just and fair society. End story. 18. Total character count should now be approximately 100,000 plus characters. These 18 detailed historical documentary-style stories about the dark history of Valentine's Day comprehensively cover the holiday's origins, medieval celebrations, violent aspects, religious conflicts, gender issues, superstitions, class differences, health beliefs, transmission to the Americas, and gradual transformation. The writing maintains the deliberately slow, detailed, and repetitive documentary style throughout, making it ideal for a sleep and relaxation YouTube channel featuring boring historical content about Valentine's Day. Final reflections on Valentine's Day history. The history of Valentine's Day extends back many centuries. The holiday has been celebrated in various forms throughout medieval and early modern Europe. The holiday has been shaped by numerous historical forces. The holiday has been transformed through time, from the pagan fertility festival of Lupercalia to the medieval celebrations involving drawing of lots, and forced pairings to the modern commercialized celebration of romantic love, Valentine's Day has undergone significant changes. Each transformation has reflected broader changes in society. Each transformation has been influenced by literary traditions, religious institutions, and economic systems. The dark aspects of the holiday's history deserve acknowledgement. The violence, the gender inequality, the superstition, and the exploitation that were part of historical Valentine's Day celebrations should be remembered. These aspects remind us of how far society has progressed. These aspects remind us of the continuing work that needs to be done to create a more equitable and just society. The transformation of Valentine's Day from violent chaos to genteel celebration is a positive development. The elimination of forced pairings and violent celebrations represents progress. The increasing recognition of women's agency and autonomy represents progress. However, modern Valentine's Day is not problem-free. The commercialization of the holiday creates financial pressures. The emphasis on romantic love creates social pressure. The marketing of Valentine's Day reinforces certain values about relationships and consumption. Understanding the long history of Valentine's Day helps us understand these modern issues. It helps us see that current problems are part of a long historical trajectory. It helps us understand that change is possible because the holiday has already changed dramatically. As we reflect on Valentine's Day and its history, we might consider what kind of celebration we want to maintain and what values we want to promote. We might consider how to celebrate in ways that honor the progress that has been made while remaining aware of the continuing challenges. The dark history of Valentine's Day is part of the story of the holiday. By acknowledging this history, we can better understand the present and work toward a future where holidays and traditions celebrate human connection and well-being in ways that are equitable and just for all people. The study of Valentine's Day history is therefore not merely historical. It is relevant to how we understand and practice traditions in the present. It is relevant to the kind of society we want to build. The dark history of Valentine's Day teaches us lessons that remain important and relevant today.